We're going to have our Bible readings actually, and before Nadine comes to bring us the first couple, I thought I'd just give you something to listen out to, because normally we have a couple of Bible readings. This evening I've chosen 4 short ones, shortish ones, and you might think that, Genesis is the main place in the Bible that talks about God creating the world, but it's actually, it comes up quite a bit throughout the Bible, different passages that talk about creation. And so what I've done is I've chosen these 4 little snippets, 2 from the Psalms, 1 from the book of Job, and 1 from the book of Proverbs, that speak of God's creative act. And in particular, there's an ancient image that's drawn on in the first 3 of these readings, the 2 from Psalms and the 1 from the book of Job, which doesn't make a lot of sense to us, but made good sense in an ancient cultural context. And that is, there's a metaphor used to describe God creating the world as God slaying the sea monster, the great sea creature, the great chaos creature of the deep. Sometimes this sea creature is called Leviathan or Rahab or the gliding serpent. So just pay attention to when that little image comes up in the first 3 readings, and I'll make comment on it in the sermon. And then the 4th reading from Proverbs, we've got, it's really about how God used wisdom when he created the world, and wisdom was like the first of his creation. Wisdom's being personified. So let's have those readings. Thanks.
Okay, let's pray before we open God's word. Dear Lord, as we open the Psalms and your sacred and ancient text, we ask you for illumination and guidance. Help us to see your timeless truth, to understand your will, and to respond with love, obedience, and a willingness to follow your teachings. Amen. Okay, so tonight's reading is from 2 sections, Psalm 74, 12 to 17 on page 834, and then Psalm 89, 5 to 14 on page 849. But God is my King from long ago. He brings salvation on the earth. It was you who split open the sea by your power. You broke the heads of the monster in the waters. It was you who crushed the heads of Leviathan and gave it as food to the creatures of the desert. It was you who opened up the springs and streams. You dried up the ever-flowing rivers. The day is yours, and yours also the night. You established the sun and the moon. It was you who set all the boundaries of the earth. You made both summer and winter. The heavens praise your wonders, Lord, your faithfulness too, in the assembly of the holy ones. For who in the skies above can compare with the Lord? Who is like the Lord among the heavenly beings? In the council of the holy ones, God is greatly feared. He is more awesome than all who surround him. Who is like Lord, God Almighty? You, Lord, are mighty, and your faithfulness surrounds you. You rule over the surging sea. When its waves mount up, you still them. You crushed Rahab like one of the slain. With your strong arm, you scattered your enemies. The heavens are yours, and yours also the earth. You founded the world and all that is in it. You created the north and the south. Tabor and Hermon sing for joy at your name. Your arm is endowed with power. Your hand is strong, your right hand exiled. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. Love and faithfulness go before you. This is the word of the Lord.
The second two readings, the first one is on page 746 of your Pew Bible. That's Job 26, 7 to 14. The second reading from Proverbs is on page 913. So starting with Job on page 746, 26, 7 to 14. He spreads out the northern skies over empty space. He suspends the earth over nothing. He wraps up the waters in his clouds, yet the clouds do not burst under their weight. He covers the face of the full moon, spreading his clouds over it. He marks out the horizon on the face of the waters for a boundary between light and darkness. The pillars of the heavens quake, aghast at his rebuke. By his power he churned up the seas. By his wisdom he cut Rahab to pieces. By his breath the skies became fair. His hand pierced the gliding serpent. And these are but the outer fringe of his works. How faint the whisper we hear of him. The Proverbs reading is on page 913. So Proverbs 8, 22 to 31. The Lord brought me forth as the first of his works before his deeds of old. I was formed long ages ago, at the very beginning when the world came to be. When there were no watery depths, I was given birth. When there were no springs overflowing with water, but the mountains were settled in place. Before the hills I was given birth, before he made the world or its fields, or any of the dust of the earth. I was there when he set the heavens in place, when he marked out the horizon on the face of the deep, when he established the clouds above and fixed securely the fountains of the deep, when he gave the sea its boundary so the waters would not overstep his command, and when he marked out the foundations of the earth. Then I was constantly at his side. I was filled with delight day after day, rejoicing always in his presence, rejoicing in his whole world, and delighting in mankind. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks, Nadine and Rao. All right, sea monsters. No. Genesis 1 to 11, a fresh look at the primeval story, and it's a 10-week series that we're embarking upon. And I've entitled this sermon, Ancient Words, Timeless Truth. As this series was coming up, I received this email in my inbox. It was an invitation from the Family Systems Institute, sometimes called the Bowen Systems Institute. And they're running a series of courses for people in ministry to understand the system that we're part of. And the basic theory of this, I've been along to their conference the last couple of years. There's a bunch of Sydney Anglican ministers actually that are involved in sort of promoting this within the diocese as a helpful tool for understanding church dynamics. And the basic idea is that we're all part of emotional systems, whether they be our families or whether they be a church community like this that we belong to. And the system affects our behaviour, and our behaviour affects the system. That's just the way that we are, the way that we're made. And so when I saw the topic of this training module that was coming up, I thought of this series in Genesis. The module was called Anxious Togetherness versus Unity in Christ. And I thought, well, if ever there's a topic where there's a diversity of opinion amongst Christians, it's the early chapters of Genesis. And so I thought, if I do this module of the course, it'll be really helpful for navigating us through this series in Genesis. And so far I've done 2 out of the 3 weeks, and it's been really helpful. All the pre-reading and the group discussion has been good. Now, one of the things they talk about in systems theory is a couple of competing forces. There's the togetherness force. This is the basic human drive to be part of the group, to feel like you belong and you're protected and you're safe, and this is where you can just relax. And then there's also the natural human force to want to be an individual, to want to express yourself and develop and grow and work out your own thinking and your own ways of doing things in the world. And sometimes those two forces can get out of balance. And what happens when the togetherness force gets too strong is that you get what's called fusion. It's when the togetherness force dominates and individuals don't develop a healthy level of self-differentiation. That's where you get groupthink. And have you ever found yourself in a situation where your beliefs and your opinions change in light of which social group you're with? And with one group you kind of believe one thing, with another group you kind of believe another thing. That's a failure of that's a fusion. That's a failure of self-differentiation. Some of it's natural, but a healthy system, which is what we're looking for here, is one where you have unity without uniformity. That's what I'm trying to produce in this church community. I'm sure many of you are on board with that idea as well. And so an emotionally mature system, an emotionally mature church, will be a place where it's possible to have closeness and a high level of commitment to each other, whilst also this being a safe place for individuals to grow in their individuality, in their self-differentiation. So we're not all merging together emotionally and cognitively. And so I think Genesis is a great place to practice that. In some ways it's a little bit of a safe place to practice that, because within the wider evangelical world there's quite a diversity of opinion on how to take these early chapters of Genesis. And so, you could take any of the positions I'm going to talk about tonight and you could find a pin-up man or a woman and say, I hold that person's opinion, therefore I'm within the camp. So in some ways it's a bit of a safe topic, but I invite you to explore as we go through this series together, to be thinking to yourself, not which way is the wind blowing, what belief do I have to get on board with, what are the people beside me thinking, what's Dave thinking, what's Colin thinking, what's Emily thinking, but rather, what am I thinking? What sits right for me? Now, where do these early chapters of Genesis fit in the scheme of things? This is the schematic I put up from time to time, which is just an overview of the entire Old Testament. And you can see Genesis really has a couple of parts. There's the first 11 chapters. We call that the prehistory. It's very difficult to put any sort of date on this. And that's where you've got things like Adam and Eve, Noah, the Tower of Babel or the Tower of Babylon, the creation of the world, the fall into sin, the flood. And then when you get to chapter 12, you skip into this other section, which starts with Abraham, and it's the history of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, etc. And that takes you through to the end of Genesis. And so we're looking just at that first bit, the prehistory bit, what I've called the primeval history, the primeval stories. And to give you an overview of where we're going in the series, you're sitting through currently the overview sermon, which is talking about the context and how to read ancient texts. I'm preaching that one, as you can tell. And then next week we're going to look at the 7-day creation account, where God starts with the chaotic waters and brings about an ordered and functional world. That is all of chapter 1 and the first 4 verses of chapter 2. And then we're going to come back to the end of chapter 1 and focus in on that little bit at the end of chapter 1 that talks about humanity being made in the image of God and the special role that God has given to humans to play in the world. Then in week 4 we'll get into chapter 2 proper, and this is Adam and Eve in the garden, and we'll see men and women given the joint role of stewarding the world and caring for the garden. Then in week 5 we'll get into chapter 3, and this is where things go wrong. This is the snake, the talking snake shows up, and they eat the fruit, and there's the rebellion against God and all the consequences that flow from that relationally and in terms of their relationship with God and with each other, and even getting kicked out of the garden. And then I'm going on holidays to Thailand after I've stirred all that up for you. And Denver's going to be preaching sermon number 6 on Cain and Abel. And this is where we see a continued slide into sin with the descendants of Adam and Eve. And then Colin's going to pick up a few chapters in the middle there where things go from bad to worse. and the descent towards chaos accelerates with some more of the descendants going off the rails, and that culminates at the start of chapter 6 with some heavenly beings coming down and sleeping with human women, and that's like the final straw, and that triggers the flood, triggers the judgment and the salvation of the flood. Very tricky passage, that one, but I'm leaving both of those to Colin while I'm on a beach somewhere in Koh Samui. And so that'll be week 8, judgment and salvation in the flood, and then I'll come back and pick up the covenant that God makes with Noah after the flood dries up. This is where we get the rainbow, and then Noah's sin and the consequences that flow from that. And then week 10 is the table of nations, a list of all the known nations of the world back in the day, and also the Tower of Babel and the consequences that flow from that. So that's where we're going over the 10 weeks. Now, it does raise the question, what kind of origin story is this? What kind of literature is this? And I want to share an illustration that I got from this guy, John Walton. I'm quite a big fan of his. And he tells the story of, imagine you were going to the theatre and you were running late. That's almost happened to us the other week. We just got in before they closed the doors. But imagine you didn't get in before they closed the doors. And you end up having to wait till intermission, and you come in halfway through the show and you sit down and you say to the person next to you, what's happened so far? How did the play start? And the person says to you, well, the script was written in 1930. Hold on, let me stop you there. I'm not interested in when the script was written. Well, you can't have a play without a script. You said, how does it start? It starts with the script. And then the person on the other side says, I've got an idea. This set was constructed by the creative team several months ago. Hold on a minute, I'm not interested in how the set was created. Well, you can't have a play without a set. Yeah, but that's not what I want to know. And then the person in front of you turns around and says, auditions for the cast started 12 months ago and we've got a crack cast assembled. Yeah, that's great too. I know you can't have a play without a cast, but what I really want to know is what's happened since the curtain dropped. Okay, what's the story that I've missed in the first half of the play? Now, that's a good example because all of those questions, in one sense, are true and accurate answers to the question, how did the play start? You can't have a play without a script or without a set or without a cast, but it's not the question that really I wanted to know. And so when we come to Genesis, we've got to say, well, what type of origin story is it? What were they wanting to have answers to, and what do we think that we're looking at? And one of the common problems is that we read Genesis through modern scientific eyes, and we think it's answering the modern scientific question of how did the material world come into being, and what was the mechanism God used to do it. Whereas if we can put our ancient eyes on for a minute, we see this is a story about meaning and purpose. It's about who made the world, and what is our place in the world, and what is our role in the world, and why does our world function the way it functions? What's God's meaning and purpose that He's embedded into His world? And so we've got to make sure we're asking the right question. What kind of origin story is it? And we've got to remember how ancient it is. I've found this a little bit frightening to think about, but if you can see, there's a picture of our church, 2025. And if you were to go back in time to King David, you would be going as far back in time as if you went forward in time to the year 5000. Can you imagine what the world's going to be like in the year 5000? For me, it's just an unimaginable distance in the future. Well, that's how long ago even King David was. If you go back to Abraham, it's more like going forward to the year 6000. And that's to say nothing about going back beyond Abraham, back into some of this primeval history of people like Cain and Abel and Noah and Adam and Eve. And so we're talking about ancient times and ancient literature. And so it's important that we get the genre question right. We understand what type of literature we're dealing with. And here's basically a pretty simplified continuum of where you might be. And there's lots of Christians on all parts of this continuum. So feel free to identify yourself somewhere. There's some that would read the Genesis 1 to 11 as kind of like video camera history. This it's a historical account, and exactly what you read there is exactly what you would have seen if you had recorded the thing on a camcorder. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, there's those who will say what you got here is fictional myth. It's the language of mythology, and there's no historical referent behind it at all. And then in the middle, you've got a huge continuum where probably most of the evangelical world sits, and that is that these stories in Genesis 1 to 11 are stylized and symbolic retellings of real events. There's some historical event behind it, but it's so stylized and symbolic and elaborated on and creatively developed that really you end up with a story that's in the language of myth with perhaps a historical kernel behind it. And so the technical term for this is mytho-history. And, you might be on the scale, you might be a 2, and you might be down a bit more towards I'm sure there was some elaboration, maybe the dialogue was kind of invented, but most of it's, pretty, as we read it, an individual couple living in a garden, or you could be up the sort of the fictional myth end, maybe an 8 on the scale, and you say, well, yes, there was a time when humans developed in our course of evolution. There was a point where we developed the ability to relate to our creator, and whoever those original humans were, they rebelled against the creator, and all of us have been doing the same ever since. And so you would see Adam and Eve, maybe not even as symbolic of an original couple, but it may be of the first humans to evolve in that way. And so depending on where you are on that scale, there's plenty of room, and a lot of the debates are really about where you sit. Now, a good example of someone who's probably a bit more towards the 7 or 8 end is this guy, William Lane Craig, and he's a very famous Christian philosopher and apologist. You've probably come across him if you've got YouTube on your phone. And in late 2021, he wrote a book, In Quest of the Historical Adam. And he took the position that Genesis is mytho-historic, and he did a very thorough study of what is it that makes something, what makes literature mythology. And he looked at it from a technical point of view, compared it with legend and with folklore. And he concluded that the story about Adam and Eve particularly has all the hallmarks of ancient Near Eastern myth, yet it is also said to have real-world consequences. Thus, as far as he's concerned, it cannot be purely myth. No purely mythic event, no purely fictional event can have real-world consequences. And so he's adopted this position of mytho-historic, and he says it gives him a huge amount of freedom to read the literature as it's intended, as the type of literature it is, but also to hold on to some of the theological conclusions that come out of Genesis and other parts of the scripture that reflect back on Genesis that see real-world consequences flowing from the stories. So wherever you are on that continuum, that's fine with me. I'd be more up the sort of the 7 or 8 end myself personally, but I don't mind if you're down at the 1 or 2 end. Now let me just run you through some of these features of myth, because I'm wondering if this is maybe the sticking point for some of us that Craig identifies, and talk to you about how they fit with Genesis 1 to 11. Some of these are pretty basic. He says, myths are narratives, whether oral or literary. And mostly in Genesis 1 to 11, we have narrative. There's also some genealogical lists, and there's a list of nations. But it certainly fits there. Myths are traditional stories handed down from generation to generation. Now, this is true. Genesis was likely assembled in the 6th century BC or thereabouts. That was probably its final form that it got put into. But there's good evidence that much of the primeval stories in the early parts of Genesis date well back before that, hundreds of years before that, back into the second millennia BC. Perhaps even back to the time of Moses, certainly back to before Israel even had kings like David and Solomon. It's hard to say how far back these primeval stories go, but they were certainly passed down from generation to generation for hundreds of years. And in fact, if you think about it, they're still being passed down from generation to generation all these thousands of years later. Myths are sacred to the society that embraces them. That's certainly true for both Genesis, for both the Jewish community and the Christian community with Genesis 1 to 11. Myths are objects of belief by members of the society that embraces them. And again, this was true for the ancient Israelites, and it's equally true for Christians these days. Regardless of how much actual history is behind the story is still rich in theological truth, and it forms the foundation of many of our beliefs about God and about the world and about ourselves and about our place in the world. It's shaped our whole Western culture and continues to shape the church. Number 5, myths are set in a primeval age or in another realm. Definitely we've got those features in Genesis 1 to 11. The stories are set in the distant past, even for those living in Moses' day or in Abraham's day. It's the distant past. And the location has an otherworldly feel to it. The Garden of Eden is not like any place that we know of. There is some crossover, a couple of rivers that are mentioned there, the Tigris and the Euphrates, we know of them, but they're in a different configuration in the Genesis story. The 4 main rivers all flow out from the Garden of Eden, and that's unlike any geography formation that we know of, or unlike what the rivers do today. Myths are stories in which deities are important characters. In particular, in the Genesis account, there's one deity that's a really important character, the God who created the whole kit and caboodle. But there's other spiritual beings that show up in these passages. There's the good ones, like the cherubim at the end of chapter 3 that blocks the way from Adam and Eve getting back into the garden with a flaming sword that's going back and forth. And there's some of the bad ones I've mentioned already in the start of chapter 6 that come and sleep with human women and trigger the flood. Myths seek to anchor present realities such as the world, mankind, natural phenomena, cultural practices, and the prevailing religious practice back in the primordial era, in primordial time. And there is stacks and stacks of this throughout Genesis. Everything from why humans get married, to why women have pain in childbirth, to why growing crops is so hard, to why there's rainbows, to why there are so many languages. There are just dozens and dozens of these ideologies, dozens and dozens of these explanations as to, and this is why the world is the way it is, because of something that happened back in the primordial past. And so Genesis is replete with this kind of thing. Number 8, myths are associated with rituals. Now, this is one that there's not that much of in Genesis. Well, you do get the sacrifices of Cain and Abel in chapter 4, but there's not a huge amount of ritual that takes place. Number 9, myths express correspondence between deities and nature. Now, this is an area where Genesis, the early chapters of Genesis, is quite different from the myths of their ancient Near Eastern neighbours. Primarily because the Israelites are trying to be monotheists. Throughout their history, they keep falling back into polytheism, and the biblical writers keep calling them back to, no, just worship one God only. And so in the Genesis account, you don't have the sun and the moon. They're just identified as lights in the sky. They're not identified as the gods that are ruling the heavens and ruling the night. And the rivers are just rivers, and the trees are just trees. They're not deities. And then the final one that William Lane Craig identifies here is that myths exhibit fantastic elements, and they're not troubled by logical contradiction or incoherence in the story. So you can have miraculous things like talking snakes or magical trees or people living for 900 years. You can have things that we know to be false from science, like plant life being created on day 3 before the sun gets created on day 4. And I'm not much of a gardener, but even I know that you can't grow plants without the sun. Or you can have things that are just plain contradictions on the face of it, like the order of creation between animals and humans is different in Genesis chapter 1 than in Genesis chapter 2. Now, if what you're reading there is pure video camera history, that creates a problem. But if what you're reading is myth or mytho-history, then those kind of things are just part of the genre there, and we're not troubled by it. So I'm quite convinced there's a strong case to be made for the genre to be myth or mytho-history. And I've emphasised the myth part, because I thought that might be the bit where we struggle over. But what about the history part? Well, at one level, these stories are positioned such that they flow seamlessly from the prehistory stuff in 1 to 11 into the more historical stuff with Abraham in chapter 12. The genealogies just continue onwards, and there's some crossover of place names. But really, this view that it's mytho-history rather than fictional myth is really being driven by theology. We hold foundational true events in events that we would say really happened, like God created the world. And so if that didn't really happen in history, then there's no such thing as Christianity. And so it can't be pure fiction to tell a story about God creating the world, because behind the story is the reality of God creating the world. We also hold that all humans sin, all humans rebel against God. And if that wasn't true for the first humans, then that's again a core doctrine of Christianity that's out the window. And so identifying it as mytho-history is really driven by some of these core Christian convictions. And also, depending on your theology of the fall, most Christians, or at least most evangelical Christians, would also attribute real-world effects to the results of human rebellion against God. We'd say that this helps explain why the world is in such a broken state. And again, no purely fictional story can have a real-world effect, so there must be some historical kernel behind it, if that piece of theology is to be true. So I think it's for theological reasons that most have adopted the mytho-historic rather than the fictional mythology view. But there is a lot of debate all the way along that spectrum. Now let me just finish by giving you a quick example from those other readings of how this might work out in a passage outside of Genesis, so that when we come to Genesis, we're familiar with it. You might have noticed in those readings, because I drew your attention to it, that they all spoke about God creating the world, and they linked it to God destroying the great sea monster. Here was Psalm 89, "You crushed Rahab like one of the slain." Or in Job 26, "By his wisdom he cut Rahab to pieces. By his breath the skies became fair. His hand pierced the gliding serpent." Or in Psalm 74, the language is even more mythologized. "It was you who split open the sea by your power. You broke the heads, plural, of the monster in the waters. It was you who crushed the heads of Leviathan." Now, it turns out that Leviathan, or Rahab, or the gliding serpent, was well known in the creation mythologies of ancient Israel and ancient Israel's neighbours. This creature is a primordial sea serpent that personifies chaos and danger, often associated with the sea. It's mentioned several times in the Bible, not just these 3 times. It pops up quite a few times. And also in surviving texts from the ancient Near East. Here's a shell inlay. This is in the museum in Jerusalem, the Jerusalem Museum. And it depicts an ancient Mesopotamian god, a guy called Marduk, fighting against Leviathan. And if you count the heads, you've got 7 there. And so this dates to the middle of the 3rd millennia BC. Now, southern Mesopotamia, that's where Abraham's family was from. Remember, he didn't grow up in Canaan. God called him out of Mesopotamia to come and migrate. So perhaps this mythology came with him as he moved to Canaan. We also know of Leviathan from ancient Ugaritic texts, which were discovered in Syria, and there was several discoveries. The first lot was discovered in 1928, and then a bunch more in 1958, and then again in 1973, and then a bunch more in 1994. So pretty recent, 1,500 tablets all up, and dating back to around about 1200 BC. And in these Ugaritic texts, Leviathan is also a seven-headed sea creature who is defeated by their god, the storm god Baal, or Baal-Hadad. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, there's no explicit reference to Leviathan having seven heads, but as we saw in Psalm 74, it does talk about Leviathan as having more than one head. Now, that's a little bit of historical analysis, and it's highly suggestive that what we're talking about here in the Bible is not some natural creature. It's the same kind of primordial chaos creature common to the myths of Israel's ancient neighbours. These passages are a poetic retelling of God creating the world in mythological language. God did create the world, that there's a kernel of historical truth behind it, but it's being told in mythological language. And it was the culturally appropriate way for them to tell the story. In a sense, what they're saying is it wasn't Marduk that brought order out of chaos. It wasn't Baal-Hadad that brought order out of chaos. It was our God. It was Yahweh. He was the one that crushed the chaos monster. He brought safety. And so I think the wrong approach is to try to make passages like this that use mythological language to try to make them fit with science. And how would you do that? Well, you would try to identify perhaps Leviathan with some now extinct dinosaur. Or actually a lot of interpreters throughout history have gone down that path and can come up with all sorts of suggestions. A giant squid or an oversized crocodile or a big whale that was spouting its water at sunset or something like that. And it's actually the discovery of these ancient texts from Israel's neighbours that have helped biblical interpreters see that that's a wrong-headed approach. And it's also worth pointing out that whether or not the author of the Psalms and Job understood Leviathan to be real or mythological, that doesn't actually put any obligation on us to hold the same worldview that they had. God communicated to them through their ancient worldview in concepts that they understood. And so what we do as responsible modern readers is we look for the meaning in the text, not the worldview in the text. We don't have to adopt their worldview, but it's written with meaning for us. And I'm sure if the Psalms were being written today, they wouldn't be talking about sea monsters, they'd be talking about black holes or supernovas or distant galaxies. And God was the powerful God that brought them into being. And so, throughout this series, I'm inviting you to think about where you sit on this continuum, to not be so concerned about which way the wind is blowing and what the person sitting next to you thinks, or even what your spouse thinks. But what do you think? Do that work of self-differentiation yourself. Hold the anxious togetherness force at bay so that you've got the space to develop your own thinking on the matter. And just in case you're a bit fearful of what this series might hold, the rest of the series is not going to be this kind of meta-analysis, top-level look. I've wanted to get it out of the way as much as possible in this first sermon so that we can focus on the meaning and the purpose of the text and the application of the text to our lives as we get into these primordial stories. They are ancient words, and we've got to understand them as ancient words, but they have timeless truth for us. And I fear that if we get caught up in the modern debates about science and evolution and all that, we're going to miss the meaning of Genesis 1 to 11. We're going to miss the impact that it could have on our relationship with each other our relationship with God, on the way we view our role in the world and our calling in the world. There's lots of really good practical wisdom there in Genesis for shaping the way we think about those things. And so that's what I'm hoping to spend this series on. But I hope that this initial sermon clears away, probably I'm not sure I've generated 100 other questions, but clears away some of those hot button issues so that you can hear the meaning and the purpose behind the text in weeks to come. And as I say, if you want to jot down a question on the comment card, by all means, do so. Let's finish with this quote. Remember, we're looking for unity without uniformity, and in essentials we want unity, in non-essentials liberty, and in all things charity. Let's sing in response, and we're going to sing of God's amazing grace to us